Let me start with your being hired at the University of Maine as the Stephen E. King Chair in Literature. At the time, what was the job description?
Right. Well, they were looking for a Shakespearean. The chair was endowed by the Harold Alphon Foundation with a mission to support the public humanities, and that was the position. So they weren't looking for a horror expert. It was a Shakespearean, and I am a Shakespearean.
Did you have any misgivings about the job? Did you think, they know I'm a Shakespearean expert, but they're going to drag me into Stephen King?
No, I would have loved that. No, if anything, I was told the opposite, which is this has nothing to do with Stephen King. He gave his permission to have his name used, but you should not initiate any contact. So I was happily doing my job at the University of Maine for 4 years before I got a phone call at home saying, "Hi, it's Steve King."
And you were a little surprised at the beginning when the university gave you those specific instructions. Don't reach out to him.
Well, I wasn't surprised per se. It was more just, oh, okay, a little disappointed. But, I understand he's a private person. And because he wasn't really a part of this endowed chair, it made sense to me as an academic. I know how endowed chairs work. So I wasn't surprised. But again, a little disappointed.
And then the phone rang.
And then the phone rang.
Voice on the other end.
I was actually standing right there when I got the phone.
Hi, this is Steve King.
A cold call from Stephen King at my house. And he just said, I think it's time we met. So I invited him to come speak with our students at UMaine in a super secret situation. The students were wonderful. They kept it under wraps. He came to speak to them 2 days in a row, and it was magical. It was really amazing. And that's when I learned what a generous human he is.
He, of course, attended the University of Maine.
Yes.
While he was there to talk to your students. You took him around, showed him the offices of some of his favorite professors.
Yes, I showed him the Burton Hatlin room, which is dedicated to his favorite professor from 1966. And he remembered his office because he had taught at the University of Maine for 1 year in 1978 when he wrote Pet Sematary. It was Old Home Week.
I have to laugh at your account of that in the book because the thing that you were the most nervous about was making sure that you kept a parking space that he could use.
I know. Well, because I wasn't supposed to tell anybody about the visit. And I'd been managing it for months by myself. Like I couldn't tell my colleagues, I couldn't tell media, I couldn't tell upper administration, just those students. So yes, for me, I decided I was going to fixate on making sure he had a parking spot because he insisted on driving himself. I said, I can come pick you up at your house. He says, nope, I'm going to drive myself and you can just hop in the car and show me where to park. And I'm thinking, well, okay, Stephen King, I'll hop in your car. And I should say, I'm a huge King fan, if that's not clear. So I started reading him when I was 12. And so part of my attraction to this job was just to have my name associated with one of my favorite living writers, besides Shakespeare, who's obviously not living. So I was thrilled. So when I met him, I was very fangirly.
Let's go back and cover some of that personal history. You grew up in New York City, but you spent summers in Castine.
That's right.
And it was as a teenage girl going to the Castine Library.
The Witherly Memorial Library.
That you took out books by Stephen King and got engrossed.
That's where that was the gateway, was Night Shift, which was on the bestseller paperback stand in the library. I grabbed it because the cover was so shocking. I didn't know anything about Stephen King. And then I was pulled right in. The Boogeyman, story number 6. I still can't sleep next to an open closet. And from there, I just couldn't stop.
His novels kind of tapped into something in you because you were, forgive me if this is an incorrect term, you were kind of a scaredy cat yourself.
I was a scaredy cat. I was a very anxious little kid. So from as long as I can remember, I always wanted to stick right close to my mom. And so why on earth was I picking up a Stephen King book? I think honestly because I didn't know what was inside. And once I got pulled in, I just couldn't stop reading. And so part of this project for me as I've been writing this book has been understanding more why fear works on us and the purpose of a horror story as a way to metabolize our fears and our anxieties. So again, going through reading drafts of The Boogeyman and trying to understand how did he craft that? Why is that still stuck in my head? And then getting to talk to him about it really helped me understand more of my deep fears and why it is that that story in particular grabbed me when I was 12.
A few years ago, an opportunity came along which you could not resist. You were on sabbatical, and you pitched the idea of immersing yourself in his archives at his home in Bangor,
Yeah.
and he and his wife Tabitha said, yes, go ahead and do it.
It was unbelievably generous. So yes, they had just gathered all of his manuscripts, as many as they had, drafts, and put them in a climate-controlled space that they had built attached to their iconic Bangor home. And they hadn't really let anyone in there yet, certainly not for any extended period of time. And enough trust had built up between us, since I had invited him to come talk to my students, that I think he felt comfortable, he and Tabitha, letting me be the first one in there. And it was kind of an experiment for them too, seeing how was it going to work, like having somebody in there, and how, where would they sit, and how many manuscripts can you have at one time? So I'd like to think that I was helpful in that way, and sort of being the guinea pig, happily, to see what that would be like for them as well. So it was an enormous gift and a treasure trove of materials.
This was really something special because they had not given the keys to the vault really to anyone else.
No, and to be clear, I didn't actually have the keys. Like, it's very well protected, which is great. Like, I'm very happy that the manuscripts are in a safe space. It's not like I was allowed to go in there and just paw through things. It's very well now guarded, and it's behind a locked door that I'm not given the key to. But yes, metaphorically, yes, given the keys to the kingdom.
You decided to focus on the early papers that he had in the archives from 5 books that you had read as a young girl.
Yes.
4 novels and 1 short story collection.
Yes, yeah.
Was that the only kind of way that you could maintain your sanity? Was by
yes.
not trying to tackle the entire, 60 plus novels?
No, and it was important that I had parameters set up for myself and also for them, so that they knew precisely why I wanted to go in there. And when I talked to them about this, I said, I really just want to understand how you got into my head. How did you craft these 5? So the 5 that I look at are The Shining, Carrie, Pet Sematary, Salem's Lot, and Night Shift, because those were the ones I read when I was a teenager. Those are the ones that were still stuck in my head. Also The Stand, but that is so big, I just couldn't tackle that one as well. So I really wanted this to be a book, because I've written lots of academic books, but I didn't want this to be an academic book. I wanted it to be one where I could bring my personal journey as well in, and my memories of reading King as a kid. And I think that really helped my exploration and my deep, close reading of these manuscripts, because I was really alert to what were word sounds, what were changes he was making, what were the lines that I still remembered 40 years later. How did he get there? So I wrote this book for a wide audience, because I really feel like so many people love Stephen King, and so many people would be interested in understanding how this master writer crafted these stories that have had such endurance. So yeah, that was the story.
You wanted to closely examine the words, the sentences,
Yes.
and see how they held the key to the power of these books. Yeah. What did you find when you dug into these things?
I mean, for each of the books that I looked at, and I just went one at a time because there's so many drafts for each one, really a different story revealed itself as I was doing the work for each one. So with Pet Sematary, which was the one I started with, what became clear, because I found this draft with these copy editor notes to him and his responses, where he was circling, the copy editor would circle words and say, is this the word you wanted? And he'd be like, yes, say it out loud, you'll see. He would write that in the comments, and I thought, he cares so much about word sound. So for that particular book, it became a story about grit sounds, right, that are clanging on the reader's ear. That was what he said to me when we were having a conversation about it. The Shining was a whole other adventure. That one, and again, I didn't know what I would find when I went in there. So for The Shining, I got to read the first draft called The Shine, which is a completely different ending. It's divided up into acts and scenes. It's a play. So for that became about, and then I found out he was imagining a Shakespearean tragedy when he wrote The Shining. So that, as a Shakespearean, blew my head up in a different way. And for me, that became about how he's crafting, how he's using theatrical conventions, right? The limited stage sets of the Overlook Hotel, but also diving deeply into a classic Shakespearean tragedy to get at the psychological, intergenerational trauma that is at the heart of that book. So that was a whole other thing that became clear to me as I was reading those drafts. For Night Shift, it was about his college years.
You knew this going in, but it was your great good fortune that what he has there in the archives are paper manuscripts.
Paper.
And this doesn't happen nowadays when writers, of course, work on computers and can do all their revisions and deletions and so forth just with one stroke. But you could see the notes that had been jotted down, where he's changing a word, where he's changing a character, where he's changing a plot line, and you could see how the stories evolved. What was that like for you to sort of be a literary detective following the path?
Well, of course, a thrill for me as a literary scholar. I can't do this with Shakespeare, right? So to be able to track and really unravel a mystery and then get to take people with me on this journey was such a thrill. So iconic lines like "dead is better" from Pet Sematary, for example, that was one where I found he had scratched out the word death and in his handwriting written dead. Like you could see he was thinking, no, death is better is different, right? Dead is better. Dead is better has a sound to it, right? It resonates, it echoes, and it's become an iconic line from the book. So, you know, again, it depends on which of the books I was looking at. Each one had its own story. Carrie was completely different the first draft. I mean, she's an alien with horns. So that was, in some ways, not that it was easier to notice the differences, but that became a story for me about how he understood how to change and craft a teenage girl, which is what I was working on in my own research with Shakespeare. So I was seeing things about how he was really honoring what her brain could do, not just making her pathological as he was drafting her and changing her.
It's also interesting to see how, even though he was a young writer who was only beginning to taste success, he wasn't afraid to push back against the editors and the copy editors. And they would say, well, really, that's not quite the right word. It's sort of a made-up word. And he'd say, no, leave it.
Yes, although that was 1982 when I saw it. So that was Pet Sematary, you know, that was almost the final draft of Pet Sematary. In the early days of like Carrie, when he's trying to get published, he hasn't published a novel yet, that's a different story. So you don't see him pushing back in quite the same way in the margin notes. Maybe he's having conversations with Bill Thompson, his editor. But, you know, as he told me, he's like, I was a new writer. I had to do whatever Bill Thompson said, right? He hasn't become a famous writer yet. So that was fun too, sort of tracking when did he start to get more assertive about his choices. Yeah.
After you had the chance to be in there, and get over sort of the first, you know, rush of excitement of I can't believe I'm here and I'm doing this.
I don't think that ever went away, but
after you'd been there for, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 months, what was it like? What was sort of your daily routine?
So my daily routine, again, it would depend. So I went work by work. So I would usually spend about 2 months per work and then take a little break between just to air out my brain. And also then I would go and read the published version before I would go in to read the archival drafts, just to remind myself, because some of these books I hadn't read in 40 years, so I wanted to remind myself of what they were like. And one of the parts of the project was I made sure to get the original text, the versions that I had read in the 70s. So I'd go on eBay or go to the Chicken Barn in Ellsworth. That's where I got Pet Sematary from 1983. So I would take some time and actually go back and read, and then I'd go back. And then I would really just depended on what I was interested in looking at. So for The Shining, for example, I wanted to really track, I mean, that one, some of those scenes are so dense that I really needed to see the drafts next to each other. So in that case, I would say, okay, Julie, please, can I have the 3 drafts of The Shining and lay them out so I can see the woman in room 217 and how she evolved. But it would depend, you know, on what I was working on each day. What I would ask to see. But it always involved close reading.
The book that you wrote is not an academic book. You wanted this to be a book that people at a lot of different levels could appreciate.
Absolutely.
That must have been fun for you and sort of liberating, I would think.
Absolutely. Because I could still bring in my rigorous literary scholar self. You know, this is a journey through the act of close reading. But it was liberating in the sense that I could tell my own story. I didn't have to pretend this was a completely impersonal academic exercise. I was bringing my own childhood fears and memories forward, and it was so fun. I mean, it was the most fun book to write that I've ever written, and I've written a lot of books, but this one was such a special experience, and I could talk to him and weave that in as well. So it was also weaving in some of his biography and some of his insights now, looking back 50 years later, because some of these manuscripts he doesn't remember. why would he? He's written so many things. So it was so fun to be able to show him a manuscript page and say, hey, do you remember this margin note that you wrote? And a lot of times he would, which is amazing. Because at the beginning I wasn't sure about his handwriting. I'd be like, is this your handwriting? He'd be like, yep, that's my handwriting. And yep, I was doing research about, grave liners, and I figured I wanted a concrete grave liner added to the horrible scene in Pet Cemetery, and which changes the whole trajectory of that scene, because it gets exponentially harder if you put a concrete grave liner in there. So fun that I could also fold in his own insights as a legendary writer, looking back at his own writing and having this kind of dialogue with himself was really fun for me to be able to record as well.
He was so generous in talking to you.
Yeah.
What were those, in general, those conversations like?
They were always it really depended. Sometimes they'd be email exchanges, but here's the thing, he gets back like that. He's so fast and so thorough and detailed and fun, and still himself, still his voice, right? So I was asking about a change to the ending of Pet Sematary that I had noticed from the beginning to the end. And he told me this just very funny anecdote about how he was using a Wang word processor at that point, and how he ended up hitting delete and losing the ending that he had drafted. And so that was just a hilarious conversation that we had. But sometimes I'd ask him a very specific language question, like this word, do you remember changing this word? And then we would have a really fascinating dialogue about word sound, word choice, how he does remember why he changed that word. Sometimes it's about character changes that he would make, so it really depended. Sometimes it would be a very quick one-off response, like when I finally asked him, what's the Shakespearean tragedy that you were imagining when you wrote The Shining? Because I didn't want to know. I wanted to just read for myself and see if I could figure it out. It was a great mystery. And then when he finally responded, it was the pithiest, most hilarious answer he could have given me. But sometimes he would send me an entire poem that inspired him to write, like Salem's Lot, for example, a James Dickey poem, where he'll just give me the entire text of a poem. So sometimes it was a conversation about literary influence. It really depended on what I was asking him.
Speaking of manuscripts again, one of my favorite stories in the book is about how he had finished the first draft of, I think it was The Dead Zone, went on vacation to Hawaii, came back, and just had it in a check bag.
Check bag.
And
the only draft he had.
The only draft. This is again pre-computers. Got home, opened the bag that his manuscript was in, and found what?
An avocado.
And no manuscript.
No manuscript. So a woman had taken his bag unintentionally, and he had her avocado, and she had the only version of the Dead Zone.
He did.
And he calls the airline, and they figure out who it is who has it, and he talks to her, and she's kind of an elderly woman, and she says, well, yeah, okay, I'll drive and meet you, but we got to wait for the weather to get better because I don't drive in the snow. Like, wow, okay. I'm sure she had no idea who he was.
There's another story in the book, I think it's The Stand. He had the finished manuscript there, something like 1,200 pages.
Yeah.
He's delivering it, I believe, to the editor in New York,
New York,
walking block after block after block through Manhattan. And the manuscript had been wrapped by his wife in saran wrap.
I know, I love that story. Because I totally relate to that, because I'm a worst case scenario kind of person, as you can imagine, like trying to get a parking spot for him and things like that. And I was like, yeah, I see you, Tabitha. I would have done the same thing. Don't let that thing go out there without, safety, without a saran wrap wrapping. So, yeah.
You actually did some research outside of the archives in Bangor. For instance, The Shining was inspired by Stephen King's stay at the Overlook Hotel in Estes Park, Colorado.
Yes, I took a field trip.
You went and stayed there yourself.
I didn't. I was too chicken to stay in the actual hotel, which is apparently haunted. And you can pay extra to stay in room 217, but I was not going to. I am a scaredy cat still. So I stayed on like a satellite property they had that I knew had no ghosts. But I did still visit. I went up the brass elevator. I was a little pit in my stomach scared of that. So I got to see that. And so there have been field trips galore around this book. Obviously, I went to Durham, which I hadn't been to before. And that gave me so much insight into that, and talking to him about moving there when he was an 11-year-old boy. I really understood Salem's Lot in a different way, that is a story about, that's a love letter to his hometown. So doing that, and then for the night shift chapter, researching and reading all of his columns he wrote as an undergraduate in the Maine campus newspaper. And those are at Fogler Library at the University of Maine. So that was a whole nother kind of excavation, kind of field trip. Yeah, so there have been so many fun parts to this journey. Some of them scary, but most of them fun.
So when you started this project, sort of your end goal was to try to figure out what makes Stephen King's stories work, why they touch people so, and why they have endured for half a century in some cases. What did you in the end conclude?
I would say two things. One, just really seeing how intentional he is with crafting his language. Much like a brilliant line of Shakespearean verse, it stays in your head because of how gorgeously crafted it is. So part of it was, that's part of why it endures. But I think the deeper message I took away was that it's not about the monsters. The monsters are scary, but the monsters are just a way to get at deeper human, real fears about grief and loss. That was really at the core of every single one of the books that I researched. And I could see him emphasizing that as he drafted and really making it much more focused and intense. And so I think they endure because he knows how to tap into these deep human experiences of grief and of loss and the fear of loss. Right? So many of his own stories based in his own fear of losing people that he loved, or actually losing people that he loved. So yeah, I guess it made me feel like we're maybe a little less alone when we read horror when it's really well crafted, because we can share these experiences that we're all having and that are coming for all of us, sadly, grief and loss. And that it's a way to metabolize maybe some of those fears about what's coming for us. I mean, he writes really beautifully about that, about the story he wrote about his mother's death, The Woman in the Room, which is the last story in Night Shift. It's not supernatural. And it's a story that he's written really eloquently about how he returns to it and he reads it periodically, even though it's not a happy story, because it makes him feel a little bit better. And he says, well, if there's any better reason for reading and writing stories, I don't know what it would be. He says, this is why we read and write stories.
Has he read your book?
Yes.
What did he say about it?
So he really, really likes it, and he posted that it was the best book about his writing process he's ever read, which makes me feel so gratified to know that this book spoke to him and that it seemed to have been something he finds authentic about his own writing process. That makes me feel really, really good.
You're a Shakespearean scholar. We're still reading and watching and touched by Shakespeare 400 years after the works were written. How long do you think Stephen King's works are going to be read and enjoyed?
I think just as long as Shakespeare's.
Really?
I really do. I really do. Maybe not all 70 of them. It's probably going to be 100 by the time he's done. But you know what? I think The Shining is going to endure. I think that one, the way he taps into intergenerational trauma, it's so gorgeously and tightly written. He jokes and says they're going to remember the clown. They're not going to remember me. He thinks it's going to be it. It is also a terrifying one. But I wouldn't be surprised if people are reading and talking about The Shining 400 years from now.